everyone, and welcome to The Untold. Today we have Kenneth Morris as our guest, Chairman of Conservative Friends of Romania. Hello, Kenneth. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me. Pleasure.
I'd like to start off with the following subject. Tim Constantine from the Washington Times told me in a previous interview that in the United States, the press was once genuinely objective. Journalists simply reported the facts and readers were left to make their own interpretations. That model, he said, has radically changed. Do you observe a similar shift in the United Kingdom?
So we do indeed. What I would say is that in the United Kingdom is perhaps slightly different to the US. So historically our papers have always been quite ideological, but they've been very open about it. And certainly the way of thinking would be our newspapers were both national and imperial. Mm-hmm. So they both had to cover those interests simultaneously. So there would sort of be a lot of consensus on a lot of points from a political point of view. But over time, indeed, our society has fractured. And as, of course, a lot of new money has come in, things have changed. What I would say is that what marks the difference in the UK is the proliferation of polemics now. It's much more extreme. There's much less emphasis upon the facts and interpreting them, to now it's just sort of all about shock and scandal and so on, sort of easy click sort of press. So it's really degenerated. And also trust in the press has gone down. We had a phone tapping scandal. We had things like the Iraq war, the financial crisis, even going into especially Brexit and COVID. This basically shattered any sort of belief in the traditional press amongst a large portion of the British population. And for those who still would follow the mainstream press, they're extremely polarized now. So that journey has taken place. Where you have remnants of quite objective, quite good journalism will be in the smaller niche publications and perhaps online publications or social media commentators, that sort of thing. But that's what we're left with at the moment, yeah.
In the age of artificial intelligence, when high-quality text, photos and videos can be generated in seconds and appear undistinguishable, actually, is traditional objective journalism still possible?
Well, I think it's more necessary than ever. It has to be, because now it's all about verifying the sources, knowing where the primary sources are and so on and so forth. In the past, there was perhaps a sort of implicit trust that journalists had to have evidence before they published something and so on and so forth. Now that trust has waned. I think now the good journalists will come out more than ever. So there's probably more of an emphasis on perhaps explaining to the public how things are done, perhaps a journalist going through their methods with a bit more rigor. And I think now it's just, it will just sort the wheat from the chaff. But definitely traditional journalism is more than ever required to help us distinguish, because as you say, with AI and things, now it is becoming for the average consumer almost impossible to distinguish between things. And then in the end, you can risk having just AI speaking to AI, people using tools to assess other things and so on. And you need the human touch to get back to reality. So absolutely.
Do you believe the general public still has the tools and discernment to distinguish between real information from sophisticated disinformation? Or have we maybe reached a point similar to the propaganda-saturated eras of the 20th century, where most people simply chose the truth that aligned with their worldview?
I think it's a little bit of the latter. But what I would say is, look, I believe in the common sense of the people. The average person's got common sense. They know what they're doing. What they don't have now is the time. The time to actually go behind everything. When you read the news, you want it to be there. You want to read it, see it, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever time you allocate, and then you're done. People don't have time to spend 2, 3, 4 hours researching every piece of news before they can even form an opinion and then act upon it. So I think there's a big time issue. And when you have things like that, the idea is perhaps you have the economy of scale that an institution would provide. So you need that trusted institution of journalism to be able to feed through trusted information to the people. So what people need to do is find the sources that are trusted and perhaps go to them as opposed to the mainstream. Whether they have the time to do it or whether we have the time to get through to them in time, it's a very difficult question, I think, and it's one that will inevitably involve some kind of state interaction, some sort of situation where political parties have to start talking about this openly, as opposed to just the other bits and bobs that they would do. Normally they have to say, okay, before we can even discuss any major issue, we need to know the truth, we need to have the facts, and they need to push that. And so in that way, political parties of all stripes, if they want to be legitimate, should probably wear as a badge of honor that they support independent journalism, you see, and then the people can take it from there. As for the 20th century side, that is very much what the left wants, because whether it's communism or national socialism or whatever, what you want is a compliant population that you can feed information to that won't be questioned at all. And that really is what we saw in Brexit in the UK. The arguments coming from the left were pretty fantastical in many cases. Same with COVID. There was a lot of propaganda out there, extreme propaganda, to sort of just get people to do what you want, as opposed to trusting in their common sense, as I say. So the left want to push it for that, though the right won't accept it. Ultimately, with the internet, it should be impossible. So then it all comes down to what you do with the online space, and how you can keep that accessible to the public.
Now, we are currently witnessing a growing trend across Europe and beyond, where major media conglomerates are being acquired or heavily funded by political parties or oligarchs closely aligned with them. From a historical perspective, media capture has often preceded democratic erosion, as seen in various 20th century cases. What does this phenomenon mean for the health of democracy today?
So, from a democratic perspective, obviously it might be a bit concerning. And so what it really shows is that political parties in the past relied upon vast support networks of members, activists, and a population which took an interest in politics. For example, you had a lot of, in the UK, we'd have a lot of trade union memberships, you have a lot of political party memberships, and everyone, whether you agree with them or not, was part of some sort of movement. Similarly, you'd have things like churches, where people would be getting together every week and hearing opinions on so on and so forth. People were quite plugged in to the sort of the middle area of information between the state and the people. Inevitably, nowadays, we're in a bit of a tricky situation. And so what's happened is, as people have become less informed because they've been less interested in politics and about the nuances of politics, inevitably, political parties have in a way been forced to invest more in things that they'd rather not have to invest in some cases, because there are cases where now political parties have to run a lot more these sort of media activities just to try and actually reach their own voters in many cases, which then opens the door to other such activities. I think it's not inherently wrong to have, of course, for example, just publications that are political. If a publication says, I believe in this party, that's fine. When it comes to funding, there are always going to be questions. In the UK, we have quite an open lobbying culture and so on and so forth, so we kind of expect that money will be flying around. But I think because of the American example, where they required a businessman to break through to the political scene in the case of Trump, that model is now being followed elsewhere in Europe, and that does bring risks, because when you do allow business to dominate a political party, that can then affect its ideology. Whereas traditionally, you would probably expect businesses that agreed with your ideology to fund it. And in many cases, people who were businessmen would probably fund it based on religious principles or so on back in the day, and this sort of thing. We're perhaps seeing more as a concept of people taking advantage of that situation. Then you have other examples in Europe where big businesses are kind of tied in with the state. I mean, for example, in France, there's a lot of very large companies that are, in effect, their fate is intertwined with that of the state, which itself is involved in much business. So it is a problem. I think the way around it is that the more independent journalism and the more online journalism we support, the more options we'll have, and then you won't need blocks of cash going into large organizations, because you'll have a diversity of thought.
Who, in your opinion, in practice, restricts freedom of expression more severely in 2026? The state through legislation, or the major private digital platforms like Meta, Google, and TikTok through the opaque content moderation policies?
I think definitely it's a case of, in most cases, it's the latter. It is the companies themselves. It's very opaque. They have vast teams where they will decide who's to be removed, who's not to be removed. And so they're basically running the show themselves. Even perhaps major credit card companies influence things indirectly as well via different forms of content and so on. So especially in the case of, as you say, with the Meta companies, Facebook, Instagram, with TikTok, And then with X, less so, of course, quite famously. Right now, anyway, not before it was acquired. But this is a case where they have strict content moderation. Now, of course, you need some. You can't be having terrorist content promoted or stuff like that. Violence basically. But apart from things like that, the extremes of crime in that way, political discourse and so on should be very much a separate matter. But due to the centers of power of these various large media companies, social media companies, inevitably there will be some ideological creep. But then it comes over to the level by which it can actually affect people depends on the compliance of the state. So the state can restrict the activity of these companies. They are businesses at the end of the day. They want to make money. Of course, they can step in. Unfortunately, we have seen in certain countries, like the one perhaps we're in right now, where the state has sought to leverage its position to do bad things rather than good, which is a risk, and that can happen. And at the end of the day, these companies are there for money. And as long as the money's flowing, unless they're guided by some real strong ethical principles, there's a risk that they can, abuse their position.
We discussed this very issue in our last episode as well, regarding the prominent Romanian journalist Cazul Cristoiu. His TikTok account, which had amassed millions of views while openly criticizing aspects of the political system, was permanently banned without any clear or transparent justification. How do you view such cases where media voices are suddenly erased from major platforms, and what concrete practical steps should be taken legally, politically, or technologically to better protect independent journalists on these platforms?
So the example with Mr. Cristoiu is like a particular disgrace, because this is like a par excellence example of independent journalism didn't crack down on. So it's a good one to start with. I mean, inevitably, in terms of safeguards, there are some very simple things. You can make the system less opaque. There's conversation about that going on now in Europe. Look, how do we make proper appeal systems? How do you actually show the facts of why you decided to remove a particular person's account or block it or whatever? Of course, these things should be transparent, because even if you're looking from a business case between user and the platform, there should be some decency, some transparency there. When you move over into the political, there is a sort of social contract between these companies that it's understood they will almost monopolize the scene, or be a sort of oligarchy of a few companies that will take over the social media scene. Therefore, in order for them to continue making a lot of money, they do not abuse the vast potential for abuse that exists when you have access to the minds of individuals, millions and millions of individuals in the country. So there's an understanding that they won't abuse that position. There's also a secondary understanding that the state will not abuse that position to preserve itself or to shut down dissent, because ultimately social media is secondary to media itself, and media is a space originally for journalists, so it's a space for what's meant to be a respected institution, and social media stems from that. And so indeed we should have, in my opinion, I think things like special accounts for journalists, or the ability to register, to get a different sort of tick to say, look, I'm a journalist, this is a different sort of account, deserves a different sort of level of attention. Okay, code of ethics and so on, it's fine, it's a profession. But then a different procedure as well, because we understand as a society that there are funny videos and there are journalistic videos which are important to the society, whether you agree with them or disagree, that process of critique and analysis. So I think that's one thing that can be done practically alongside a transparent system. And also there is probably a question of scale as well, when example of Mr. Cristoiu, when it becomes to a certain level where it's actually a significant portion of the population that are watching these videos and so on, there needs to be a consideration of the political impact and so on that has been inflicted upon the people by removal of such an account, just blasé. So there are probably a lot of different criteria you could add that would enhance protection of various accounts, but I think it has to be done. Because otherwise we just live in an unrestricted space, but not a free space, which is a dark forest that we're wandering in. And the population become trapped in that bubble, and genuine journalism can't access them. So it's definitely needed.
Given the current political and cultural pressures across the continent, do you believe it is not only desirable, but absolutely necessary for conservative forces in Europe, from the UK to Romania to Poland, Hungary, and so on, to form a much closer and more coordinated coalition? And what forms of concrete collaboration would you personally propose?
So I certainly think so. I mean, in the case of the European right, I mean, Europe has been able to develop with such a diverse number of countries over the last 1,500 years because of its common principles, this kind of Christian foundation. So we already understand that without principles, we can't actually function as a continent. Now, we are forced to function as a continent because we're part of, in the case of continental Europe, not Britain anymore, we're part of a European Union system which ties you together in so many different ways. If you want to be able to navigate that, you need friends across the continent. Similarly, when it comes to things like veto rights, at the moment the right wing in Europe relies on a couple of countries that might veto bad legislation and so on and so forth, but you can't just hang on to one or two. If one or two governments fall, which they can fall in any democratic system, who you're left with, basically. There should be a view that, okay, it's okay to disagree on certain things, certain practical points, and everyone has their own geopolitical position and history and so on. But the principles need to be upheld. Without that, you can't have any society. Otherwise, you lead to these tragedies, like, of course, Romania and Hungary, not the Romanian right and the Hungarian right are not able to fully get on as well as they really could do, and I certainly hope they will in the coming years. And you have these tragic situations where actually countries that are very compatible and parties that are very compatible ideologically are not working together. And as the West gets ever more left in its sort of accelerationism, obviously we hope to reverse that. But as it inevitably happens, at least in the short term, Eastern Europe in particular and Southern Europe need to work together against the sort of bloc that's coming in from the northwest of Europe of bad ideas and so on. And this is a matter of life or death, I would say, to use that phrase insofar as social principles, public order, the foundation of family, how family should look like, the traditional religion of Christian people, for example, especially. It's a Judeo-Christian element there under attack in Europe. These things are fundamental. Which roads go where, or which investments are made, and things are secondary to that. So absolutely they must work together, or if we will see them be crushed one by one.
In Romania, nationalist and conservative organizations frequently remain divided and fragmented, even though we largely fight for the same core ideals. National sovereignty, traditional values, and cultural preservation. From a political and historical perspective, recalling how internal divisions weakened similar movements in interwar Europe, why do you think this pattern persists?
I think there are two main problems. One of them can happen anywhere, and that's where we have too much personality politics, where there's much more of an emphasis on sort of character assassination rather than debating the principal points, which, as you suggest, they'll probably find that people agree on 90% of things. So there's this element of attack on the personality. One would presume that this persists mostly in former communist countries due to the emphasis on the cult of personality, which persists, and the sort of innate desire for a perfect leader, which is hard to find in this life in any case. And that comes on to my second point, is I think especially in Romania, because it has a very strong intellectual culture also, there is a heavy emphasis on a sort of Marxist undertoned ideological purity culture, where you can say, okay, the man is right 95%, I agree, but he's not right that last 5%, so I hate the man. It's this emphasis on ideological purity, which is a sort of Marxist leftover, because it's very easy to control people on that basis, because, contrary to what Marxism might suggest, people are very different, even within the same country or the same group, and they have differences, and everyone has differences. So I think a big focus on principle is required. I think that hopefully, over the next couple of years, the alarm bells will be sounded over what happened at the last elections, over what's happening in the West, over what Western actors are trying to do in Romania, that people need to realize that we don't have, 4 or 5 more elections left in Romania to change your mind on things. This is a national emergency situation from the social and cultural perspective. And there needs to be open discourse where someone has to put the olive branch forward and say, look, okay, we've all disagreed on this, but now we're getting around the table for this specific reason. At this point, maybe we don't take back this or we don't take back that, but we're just saying, look, whatever we've said, people's children are more important than this, that, and the other. So someone has to have the gumption to do it, but there has to be a reconciliation. Otherwise, of course, there'll always be split right-wing parties, and there are other parties still in existence who will seek to take advantage of that. But Romania needs to act fast, for sure. So much of its population abroad, you can't just leave the country half empty forever. and expect there to be no effects, not just economic but cultural as well, the link to its actual not linguistic links, its cultural religious links and so on. You will lose it eventually if everyone's living abroad. I mean, even with the best of intentions, their children, their grandchildren need a solid connection to the country. You need to look how we can get everyone home, or most people home at some point in the coming years, and people won't do that if they think the parties that represent them or should are not unified, because they know that where there's disunity, there's room for all sorts of dodgy people to get in, and eventually then you'll just end up with more of the same and so on and so forth. So yeah.
Now, on February 5th, 2026, the French newspaper Le Monde published an article titled "The Traditional Blouse Immortalized by Matisse Becomes a Political Symbol in Romania," stating that the far right has turned the Romanian Ia, which is our traditional blouse inscribed on UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage List and celebrated by artists like Henri Matisse, into a nationalist emblem. Many Romanians interpreted the article as stigmatizing a cherished national cultural symbol simply because it is proudly worn by patriotic forces. How do you explain how a publication long viewed as a pillar of serious European journalism could frame the story in such a way?
Well, I think it's particularly interesting, especially in the light of the French establishment's interest in Romania at the last elections. So I would say there's perhaps something going on there. But on the concrete side, there certainly is a view that from the establishment French side, that things that are not compatible with French secularism must be evil. So of course they would apply that to radical Islam. They would also apply that to what they would perhaps term radical Christianity as well. And due to a sort of Orientalist view of orthodoxy that persists in parts of the West that look into it, there is this sort of suspicion that because orthodoxy has an emphasis on things like mystery and it's less based on a simple debate or laws or whatever. There is a mystical aspect to it that you cannot simply disregard with a simple publication or whatever. The people have a very, very intimate relationship to that religion, even if externally they may look very modern. Romania is a very modern country as well. Romanians abroad are very up to date and a la mode and everything else, but a vast majority of them will still hold to their orthodox roots, and it's something you cannot remove. Now, why would that be a problem? Because if you can't remove it, then you can't remove that which anchors the population to its traditional values which are seen as incompatible with whatever the French state wishes to push as the ideal. Further to that, it also it's one of the trappings. Of course, clothing is a form of communication. It does hark back to the sort of idealistic Christian image of life in the Christian village and a certain social order that comes from that, a sort of paradisial harking to that, which is still quite present in Eastern Europe because people still have a cultural memory of the pre-modern times, as opposed to in more industrialized Europe. I mean, say, for example, in the UK, industrialized, we started 250 years ago. It's quite different in Eastern Europe. People still know the comparison between village and city life, whether it's through their grandparents or their great-grandparents or themselves even, and they know the strengths and weaknesses and so on, and they can make an informed comparison. Whereas what the French state wants in this case is a polemic. They wish to say, throw off all the trappings and just join us in this new modernist setting. So it's easy to attack something that's an item. You can identify it, you can point at it and say that's the uniform of the enemy, and they're basically trying to make it into the kind of the burqa of Christianity, effectively, which is bizarre as it is. So yeah, it's a big disgrace, but I think it comes from a large sense of ignorance and fear put together.
Now, switching back to the UK, can you give us more insights on the very important upcoming elections?
The biggest thing to know about the elections coming up, there are local elections. Many of them were actually due to be cancelled by the government for objectively pretty rubbish excuses, because now, of course, they've withdrawn that cancellation. So that was Reform's push. Reform was taking the government to court to oppose this bizarre affront to democracy. That's now changed, so the game's on. All the polls indicate Reform is going to really clean up. Now, why might Reform be very successful as well? Well, of course, because the left is split. Labour have been discredited. The Green Party, as a more socialist example, is rising. And then you have in some places an independent movement that started based on particular issues like the Israeli-Palestine conflict and so on. This has split the left, which means that Reform is looking to gain a significant amount of success in these local elections. At the same time, on the right, there is a little bit of a fracturing going on. Rupert Lowe started his own movement, Restore Britain, which is making into a political party and so on. Online, this is generating a lot of debate, but ultimately, in my opinion, right now, it won't affect the local elections. I think it would be very difficult to find that many candidates to field, and in any case, it's not suitable to have multiple right-wing parties for the same reason as I say with the left. Our system doesn't provide them with any victory. Unless you win everything, you win nothing. It's first past the post. We don't have a proportional system, so you need a unified party to win the seat. There's not a list or anything like that in these elections. So effectively, it's looking good for reform, but reform now need to hold off for the next couple of months just to keep the unity. It looks like things are going good. Infrastructure is being built, and hopefully, if we do that, you'll see a lot of reform victory. And Labour, I think, will start to be replaced now by the Greens, which are much more openly socialist in the ideology they're pushing. So a bit more polarised Britain is coming this year.
I'm keeping my fingers crossed for you. Kenneth, thank you so much for today.
Thank you very much indeed. Cheers.